See, I simply point out, it takes a long time to explain it, but I simply point out TV is not a visual medium. The movies were. TV extends the hands, the scanning fingers of TV gropes out, reaches around the world and handles everything. It doesn't, there's no camera. On TV there's no shutter. It doesn't take pictures. It handles the world. The movie camera actually extended the eyes and took pictures. TV doesn't take pictures. It handles the world. It gropes, it grasps the world. And the TV child wants to, well, you know, he tries to get inside the book page. He holds it so close to him, he's trying to get inside. He doesn't sit back and look at the page anymore. It's pathetic, but they do try to get inside the book.
Raised with one limp foot on the ground of reality and the other firmly entrenched in cyberspace. My generation wasn't just raised with the screen, but in it. Reading was practically impossible for me throughout my whole childhood. Not because I couldn't, but because I hated it. My parents and teachers tried everything to get me to read. At best they could force me to scan the words of a book, all while I refused the patience to soak in any of it, accomplishing a purely mechanical style of reading, which achieved nothing. Yet the first thing I was ever so absorbed by, I stayed up all night to finish, was a novel. A visual novel granted, but a work of written fiction all the same, Yume Muru Kusuri. When I started high school a few months after reading it, literature went from my least favorite subject to my favorite. The teachers I had there certainly helped me cultivate this budding interest, but it was a visual novel which first planted that seed. So what are visual novels, and why should you care? Visual novels are a medium where 90% of its content is pornography. Of the remaining 10% that isn't blatant pornography, 90% of that contains stories written by writers who otherwise would have never gotten published. 99% of visual novels are so really,
why should I care?
For a similar reason that in the early years of the novel, it was decried as a waste of time and as a medium that was scandalizing the public. The rise of the picaresque genre, in particular in the 16th century, I'm sure raised quite a bit of this controversy.
Lazarillo de Tormes. This is the first picaresque novel, no known author. It is the life told to a judge, as in a deposition, by a petty criminal to justify his current status. He, at the end, from the perspective that he writes, is married to the archpriest mistress. So he is a front. He's a cuckold husband who is compliant with society's hypocrisies. Lazarillo tells his life from birth to the present when he writes. This is life as seen from the perspective of a low-class individual, a criminal who learned his tricks from his first master, who was ironically a blind man. But this retrospective moralizing is always tempered by the appeal of the stories about sin. Sin is more interesting always.
Novels were widely considered as a low form of art. In school, when you're forced to read a list of famous writers and analyze their work, it becomes easy to forget this fact. But what is widely considered the first modern novel, over 400 years old at this point, was itself a parody of novels. More than just that, Don Quixote even satirizes the type of people who spent their time reading novels. Cervantes offered the greatest critique of novels in his day by writing his own, which is really just a surface level reading, because honestly, Don Quixote is a celebration of the novel more than it is anything else. Cervantes was only so harsh, insofar that he was, because he loved the medium, and I think because above all else, and he expressed it with his own work, he knew that the medium had lots of potential. I suppose similarly, I can be one of the harshest critics of the visual novel medium only because I see the potential there is. I've experienced that potential, at the very minimum flashes of it. Just as I see the novel wither away in old age, largely getting ignored by generations addicted to stimulation offered by screens, I see visual novels as a medium that at least holds the potential to be a logical successor. It may be a bastard child of the novel, but it's the only legacy I can find. Considering the modern state of visual novels though, especially if you don't cherry pick for the best, I can't deny that I feel somewhat quixotic for holding this stance, but I'll do my best to explain my reasoning. Visual novels are the bastard third cousin in the media family reunion that neither novels nor video games want to claim responsibility for. They are a medium in between, sharing traits with both of its parents. But fundamentally, what all boils down to is quite simple. Visual novels are multimedia novels. Their primary content is narrative prose, supplemented with visuals and audio. They can, and often do, feature degrees of interactivity. Like video games, the interactive element can be used to deepen one's engagement with the narrative. But unlike video games, the interactive element in visual novels are there to influence the experience of reading, first and foremost. And to the degree there are interactive elements, be they branching choices or even aspects of gameplay, they should never overshadow the experience of reading, and preferably serve to enhance the reading experience by providing a spice in how the narrative is engaged with. Now, there are some works which really push the boundary between being a visual novel and a game. These borderline cases can be quite a hot topic, but they also make up the minority of cases, being able to perfectly walk the tightrope. Most works are not that acrobatic and clearly fall on one side or the other. So long as we can agree that visual novels are multimedia experiences dominated by reading and are primarily focused on telling some kind of story, then I don't care to quibble over details.
I call it the TV generation. Those who learn to read and write before TV are a very different bunch from those who learn to read and write after TV. Why? Because reading and writing act as a buffer, a cushion against the X-ray effects of TV. TV is not a picture machine. These snapshots that are going on around us belong to the old technology. They're pictures, they're not X-ray. The new technology is X-ray. The kids who have been X-rayed from the cradle, as it were, go out into the world looking for depth, for involvement.
Everything from creating a visual and audio environment to contextualize the words, to optimal inclusion of interactive elements, can allow you to get involved with the narrative in a way a traditional book could never do.
The Fall. Baba Dalgarhata Kamenar on Combron Toner on Tonton Trovahun on Scontu the Netherlook!
It might be difficult to believe, but deep in the DNA of visual novels, you can find the influences of those modernist experiments and innovations done with literature in the 20th century. In some cases, they have found a natural home with visual novels, and in a way so practical that it seems utterly mundane to the average visual novel reader. Take stream of consciousness, for instance, in its most basic form manifesting as its brother, the interior monologue. It's a staple of visual novel writing. Precisely because you have visuals and audio to express most details, in many cases the primary concern left to the writing is tracking the thoughts of the narrator. When you're dealing with a medium that is so rooted in the present moment that its most natural style of writing is the present tense first perspective, it emphasizes the fact that typically their stories are in the process of happening. Usually our account of everything comes directly from the thoughts and impressions of the narrator as they occur, in conjunction with also hearing and seeing what they do, allowing you to truly submerge yourself into their experience and thoughts. Then you have Cortázar's great experiment of multiple endings and optional narrative structures in his iconic novel from 1963, Hopscotch, achieving a truly unique literary effect.
It's a novel from the 60s and it's kind of experimental and modern and new, and it basically plays around the idea of how you should read a book. Cortázar was very into what he called active readers instead of the traditional passive reader. He considered that traditional readers were passive towards the book. They read the story in the order the author had laid out and barely interacted with it. So with his novel, Rayuela, he tried to make the reader more active and make it kind of like a co-author, in the sense that he should pick up the story and be actively involved in the way the story is told and what they read.
Pale Fire, perhaps Nabokov's second most famous work, also structured in a way that allows the reader to decide for themselves how to best approach the experience. Nonlinearity got its start with modern, postmodern experiments in literature, but has really found a new home in the visual novel medium. It's the natural implementation of these once experimental literary techniques, as well as the multimedia dimension of visual novels, which really struck me even from my first experience with one. It appealed to me almost instantly and bypassed my longtime allergy to reading. But why?
Reading requires sitting alone by yourself in a quiet room, and I have friends, intelligent friends, who don't like to read because it's not just bored. There's an almost dread that comes up, I think, here about having to be alone and having to be quiet, and you see that when you walk in. When you walk into most public spaces in America, it isn't quiet anymore. They pipe music. But it seems significant that we don't want things to be quiet ever anymore.
Aware that there has been a tremendous debasement of popular taste. Even my best undergraduates at Yale, and they are as gifted as any undergraduates I've taught at Yale, nevertheless come into my classroom having read remarkably little. Compared to.
So what's happened to us that gives us that kind of society in which people of the best young minds have not read well?
The screen.
Television screen, movie screen.
The television screen, the movie screen, and now overwhelmingly
the
computer screen, and yes, in particular, the great gray ocean of the internet, which frightens me deeply.
Reading is in decline, and at this point it's not even debatable. Of course, by reading, I'm talking about the printed word. You could argue that we read now more than ever because some level of literacy is required to interact in the online world. But that is fundamentally a different type of reading than sitting down with a book, or even an e-reader, and silently absorbing another person's thoughts expressed in carefully constructed sentences. No, in fact, literacy rates have never been higher in human history, and yet ironically, we are becoming functionally illiterate, or what I call literately illiterate. That is to say, technically able to read, but exclusively engaging with text in the most shallow ways possible, notably by expending most efforts for reading and writing into social media and not much else. The medium is indeed the message. The domination of television in the latter part of the 20th century and the internet's dominance from the start of the 21st century has infected and influenced our relationship with reading.
The Shallows comes out of my own personal experience. I've been a big user of computers, and since back when I bought my first PC, a Mac Plus in 1986, became a writer about technology, continues to be a big user of the net and a great aficionado of that. But a couple of years ago, I began to realize that I was having a lot of trouble concentrating. And I noticed it particularly when I'd sit down to read a book, something that throughout my life has come completely naturally to me. And I realized that after a couple of paragraphs, or at most a couple of pages, I had this overwhelming urge to get up and check my email, start clicking on links, do some Googling, do all the kinds of things that we're all getting used to doing when we're online.
If you look at USA Today, for example, which is our most successful new national newspaper, you observe, first of all, that it's sold on the streets in receptacles that look like television sets, as if to suggest to people, don't worry, when you buy this newspaper, it'll be just like watching television. But beyond that, when you look at the paper itself, you can see easily how much it's influenced by television. It's mostly a picture newspaper. The stories are very brief and economical.
To the extent that newspapers remain popular, they are under increasing pressure from television to be entertaining, to be headline services, to cater to a public that appears to have an ever-shortening attention span for printed matter.
One of the big flips that's taking place in our time is the changeover from the eye to the ear. And most of us, having grown up in a visual world, are now suddenly confronted with the problems of living in an acoustic world, which is, in effect, a world of simultaneous information. The visual world has very peculiar properties, and the acoustic world has quite different properties. The visual world, which belongs to the old 19th century, and which had been around for quite a while, say from the 16th century anyway. The visual world has the properties of being a sort of continuous and connected and homogeneous, all parts more or less alike, and static. Things stayed put. If you had a point of view, that stayed put. The acoustic world, which is the electric world of simultaneity, has no continuity, no homogeneity, no connections, and no stasis. Everything is changing. In the electric world, the simultaneity of information is acoustic in the form that it comes from all directions at once. You hear from all directions at once. Electric information comes from all directions at once. And when information comes from all directions simultaneously, you are living in an acoustic world. It doesn't matter whether you're listening or not. The fact is you're getting this acoustic pattern.
This new engagement with reading, this electronic form of reading, prioritizes an instantaneous and participatory quality. This is precisely why platforms like Twitter have succeeded, yet the era of the personal blog has died. Twitter limits how much you can say, and emphasizes involvement from other people. The blog encourages writing as much as you want, and prioritizes what you have to say, with participation via a comment section as an afterthought. This instantaneous, participatory world is acoustic. It's a world of the ear. This dread of loneliness while reading a book, as the American novelist David Foster Wallace pointed out, is absent in this new style of reading and writing. Because the moment you post a comment, or even read a post in social media, somebody could be writing a response to it that very instant. That's why we repeatedly refresh the tab, waiting for a response, or at the very least a like or notification. Then there's the influence of the screen. Let's not forget that baby boomers were the original TV generation, the first generation to be raised with a screen at home. Millennials and Generation Z has been raised with screens, plural. The reason that McLuhan's observations and analysis still hold so true is because fundamentally the internet, modern computers, and smartphones are just television on cocaine, emphasizing all of its aspects. It shouldn't be a secret at this point that loneliness has profound negative health effects. So if reading is increasingly having an effect on people where they feel sensitive to lonely unease,
there's an almost dread.
Precisely because good reading is ideally done alone and in quiet, it shouldn't be that surprising that people are avoiding it. This makes quite a bit of sense. As humans are social beings, we are tribal, and the tribal world is an acoustic one. In the electric era, we have been able to return to our acoustic element, albeit in a very different form. Due to the instantaneous aspect of listening, it inherently involves us, since attentively listening requires actively paying attention to something as it's happening. So if you're involved in a conversation or with a piece of music, even if you aren't participating, such as if you're just listening to a podcast or a song, you don't feel alone, because listening is still actively involving you in the moment. Being someone who is also raised in this electric, acoustically dominated world, it makes all the more sense why my first significant reading experience was with a visual novel. Reading a visual novel is not a lonely experience because you're acoustically involved, with not just music and voice acting, but sound effects there to really get you grounded in the present moment of the story. Visual novels are the only medium which prioritize a prose-based narrative, but that also emphasize an acoustic quality, going so far as to reflect this acoustic, instantaneous quality in the writing itself by favoring use of the present tense. What all of these attributes combine to do is create a novel you can go inside of. Earlier, I attributed the non-linearity common in many visual novels to the literary experiments being done in the 1960s, notably by Cortázar and Nabokov. I suspect some people are wondering why I didn't mention the influence of Choose Your Own Adventure books and text adventure games. And it's true, you can trace the origin of branching narratives in visual novels directly to text adventure games. However, there are two effects that the non-linearity of visual novels have on a reader. One is a common feeling of involvement you get by directing the course of the narrative, which is exactly reflective of a Choose Your Own Adventure book. But there's also a subtle literary effect achieved. And I believe it's this effect which is much more important for visual novels, and that's its power to recontextualize a narrative.
やっぱり、いい女には、タバコと、屋上と、そしてひらひら服だわね。
You can see this in its most extreme intensity in a work like Tsubihime, where if you get to the End Sky 2 ending, and then go back to reread the first chapter, it will become an almost unrecognizable experience. What originally might have seemed like a frivolous, almost vapid first chapter, takes on completely new significance from the context that End Sky 2 ends on, despite the fact that none of the content of Chapter 1 has changed. But whereas Tsubihime is a bit of an exception, being itself a contributor to the still active conversation of postmodernism, even visual novels that hold no pretense of literary ambition still often feature this literary effect that non-linearity has on a reader. In fact, Yumemura Kusuri, the visual novel that started it all with me, is a particularly good example of this. On the one hand, the branching narrative structure in Yumemura Kusuri seems to be there for the simple effect of involvement. There is a conflict, and you can help guide the story to a resolution. However, the experience of reading so overwhelms the relative scarcity of choices that when they do pop up, they might feel like an inconvenience interrupting the flow of reading more than anything else. And the choices themselves, while sometimes obviously significant, can just as often be inanely mundane. As a gameplay mechanic inherited from text adventure games, it comes across as clumsy. However, the literary effect of having these choices is a different story. One of the major roots revolves around a case of pretty severe bullying, with a conflict focusing on whether you get the main character involved or not, reflecting the reality that it's much easier to look the other way. The choices bear quite a bit of weight on an initial read-through, but what's interesting is that they seem to weigh even heavier on a reread. In a first reading, there's no certainty in what your actions would result in, making the burden of responsibility ambiguous. On a reread, however, assuming that you did this route first, it's as though the pistol's in your hand, so to speak. You know precisely what bad outcomes will result from looking the other way, and more importantly, you know how your involvement will bring about resolution. As a result, it's fairly common for people who read this route first to find themselves unable to read other routes, effectively encouraging a linear relationship with a non-linear narrative. As far as the theoretical potential of visual novels are concerned, there's one in particular which I've even on occasion called the perfect visual novel, and that would be Sayonara o Oshiete, When I say perfect visual novel, I mean it in a particular way that best showcases and highlights the strengths of the medium. It tells an excellent story and is executed in a way where you can't imagine it being done better in any other medium, be it traditional novelization, film, animation, or as a video game.
Sayonara, 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 sayonara.
What Sayo Oshii strives to do with remarkable success is to simulate madness. Your greatest question while reading will be whether the world itself is mad or whether our narrator is. The discontinuity, paranoia, and creeping sense of something ominous perfectly simulates schizophrenia, or a nightmarish world that has given in to schizophrenic disorder. And everything about the visual novel expresses this. What Sayo Oshii has that traditional novels featuring an unreliable narrator don't have is a sensory agreement with the narrator's perspective. It's much easier to doubt a narrator when you only have the written word to go with. In a visual novel, and specifically in Sayo Oshii, you see what our narrator sees, you hear what he hears, and you have an X-ray into his mind, reading his thoughts as they are occurring to him. Even though it's far more likely that there's something off with him rather than with the world, you're nonetheless more sympathetic to his perspective when you experience what he experiences. The sound and visual design perfectly complements the writing as well, working in cooperation with the narrative. The soundtrack is jammed with pieces that are vague yet mood-defining, emphasizing something eerie, ominous, and off, which of course is what the writing is doing as well. As though the music and narrative weren't enough to provide an unsettling experience, the visuals make it all the more effective by staging the story in an eternal twilight. Every scene takes place in the hour of sunset, no matter how much time passes, subtly compounding the sense that something is off. It's as though time, and nature itself, isn't quite adjusted properly. What the writing, sound, and visual design all work in unison to do from the start of the story is give a feeling that reality is slightly off tune. What happens as each day progresses is that the slightly out of tune knob drifts more and more off tune until things are completely distorted. Somewhat akin to Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, Sayo Oshii likewise focuses on getting you inside its narrator's head, entering inside his own warped psychology. Even when the story invites interactivity via branching choices, its purpose is to further emphasize our narrator's disturbed mental state rather than to invite genuine interactivity.
Daって先生ってすぐそうやって自分の世界に入っちゃうじゃないですか。目の前に私がいるのに。そうですよ。一体何考えてるんですか？また変なこと考えてるんでしょう。だってなんか先生、私見る目もいやらしくないですか？ まに言われます。そんなつもりないんですけど。わかんないです。そんなこと先生が勝手に思ってるだけじゃないんですか？だったら私先生も殺せちゃうんですか？先生、弓矢使えるんですか？よくわかんないんですけど。口を塞ぐ？お仕置き？痛いのは苦手です。わかんないです。教えてください。嘘ですよね。先生はそんなことできる人じゃないですよ。ねえ、本当はどうするんですか？嘘ですよね。先生はそんなことできる人じゃないですよ。嘘ですよね。先生はそんなことできる人じゃないですよ。ねえ、本当はどうするんですか？
Sayonara is undoubtedly a disturbing experience, exploring some really bleak aspects of the human mentality. It might even make you go temporarily insane during the process of reading it. And that's exactly what makes it so fun, knowing perfectly how to balance its visual and audio assets to season the narrative experience with the right flavor. Unfortunately, for now at least, it remains untranslated into English. Creating a balance where visuals and audio work together in perfect support of the narrative is the most integral part of a good visual novel. Narcissus is my personal favorite example of a visual novel that does this remarkably well and with deceptive simplicity.
景色が見える当たり前だけを望んだささやかな運命でさえ儚いものと知った見えに出るわ
To borrow the official summary, Narcissus is a story of disease and suffering, of the living who cannot help but to die, and of the dying who cannot help but to live. Narcissus manages to avoid all the usual cliches and stories of this type, and even offers a profound, if controversial, perspective. But the reason I bring up Narcissus is because its use as a medium to tell its story is iconic. Its soundtrack will stick with you for weeks after you've read it, and its visual design is tailor-made for it. You'll notice that the space which the visuals occupy is much smaller than most other visual novels, which typically take up the whole screen with the text overlaid over it, or taking up a good 80% of the screen, reserving the rest for a text box. But it's not just a smaller proportion of the screen that the visuals take up which is significant. It's a large dark framing of everything that's just as significant. What this does is place emphasis on visual change, and because of the visual design, this ends up putting a lot of focus on the words themselves. As according to the intended effect of simulating a cinema screen, the large dark framing centers your focus. However, because most of Narcissus' art is subdued, plain, and static, your attention quickly gets bored by the visuals and begins focusing on anything dynamic that's being centered on. And because of the typewriter style of presenting the text, this will funnel your focus to the words. The visuals are the center focus, and when they change, even if only subtly, your eyes will automatically shift focus back on them. However, after a couple of seconds of absorbing the new image, your eyes will reprioritize the dynamic text. In this way, Narcissus can play around with his visual presentation, but still place most of his weight on the words. This is what makes this opening sequence so memorable, because without even noticing it, your eyes are moving back and forth between the changing visuals and the text, having the screen and the text work together to absorb your focus.
眩しかった日のこと。そんな冬の日のこと。確かに幼い頃から丈夫な方じゃなかった。どうやらいい気がしないらしい。普通に生きている人にとって私の存在ってのはだから消されたようだった。いくつもの季節白い梅雨空を誰とも言葉を交わす必要もなく過ごした。私の英語の教科書は1年生の中間テスト以降まっさらな状態だった。そこで私の時間も止まったらしい。
What this frequent shifting between images does in this sequence is give an illusion of dynamicism with the visuals. None of it is animated, but the visuals nonetheless feel alive and provide a constant new context for the words, making optimal use of this medium's strengths by putting the text, visuals, and audio all in conversation with each other. That is good direction in a visual novel, and it serves the purpose of infusing the words with the impressions that only visuals and audio can achieve. There is a poetics to visual novels, and although they are clearly quite different from the conventional novel, as well as to standard video games, it should also be clear that echoes of both mediums pulsate throughout its veins, allowing it, in the form of its platonic ideal at least, to combine the strengths of both mediums to create a unique storytelling experience of its own.
Now, the rearview mirror is sometimes called the learning theory that we have to go from the known to the unknown. In fact, this means that whenever you encounter the known, the unknown, you translate it into what you already know. In other words, you avoid it. The only person who dare encounter the unknown, the new, directly, the Gorgon, without a mirror, is the artist. Artists, in any age, are experts in direct encounter with the present, and they report their probings and findings in all sorts of grotesque designs. What the pop artists are telling us, you see, is that the environment itself has now become a work of art.
There's nothing I've ever done in my life that I've felt as comfortable as when I'm out painting, doing a piece or scribbling on a train. There's nothing that beats that. It's the rawest art form ever. It's the rawest hobby you could be involved in. It's not like you go out there and you lose today, or you fucking, you won't win, and then you know, or you get sent off the field. It's like, you fucking lose, you lose, man, that's it. It ain't no second chance shit. That's what's so real about it. I know exactly why graffiti's illegal. It's because of the fucked up world that we live in. It's run by fucking money, which is a fucking train that I fucking paint is illegal because I didn't pay the fucking train company for my advertisement to run on the train. I got my advertisement for free because I'm a smart enough human to rock up and do something without paying for it. Where everyone else, because they abide by rules and regulations, all they do is give their money up and their shit runs all city, man, because they paid for it. Because we don't pay for it, our shit just gets cleaned off and we've got a bunch of rejects running around looking for us.
La tarea del arte es esa, es transformar, digamos, lo que nos ocurre continuamente, transformar todo eso en símbolos, transformarlo en música, transformarlo en algo que puede perdurar en la memoria de los hombres. Es nuestro deber ese, tenemos que cumplir con él, si no nos sentimos muy desdichados.
From esteemed literary figures like Borges, to humble graffiti artists like Jizzo, the creative drive which motivates artists of any type, I think is much the same. It's a desire to explore and to innovate, to creatively express an understanding of the present in its raw form. In this digital age of ours, where our relationship with reading is changing, I guess I see visual novels as a new, still mostly unexplored frontier of sorts. Maybe it's mostly a barren desert for now, with a small oasis here and there. But don't deserts tend to reward huge reserves of oil to those willing to search and dig through them? So this new frontier may prove to be more important than many currently recognize it to be.